The environmental and thermonuclear issues of the 21st century are rapidly destroying hope for the survival of the human race. Meanwhile, the survival agenda of the leaders of the greatest generation is ignored. For example, who among us is aware that President Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his Four Freedoms speech, said that the post-war world should be structured in worldwide disarmament, to the point where no nation would be in a position to commit aggression against another nation anywhere in the world? In an address on NBC television February 9, 1950, and in his book Einstein on Peace, Albert Einstein, in the name of survival, called for world government. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb. After his bomb was dropped on two cities in Japan, Oppenheimer was horror-stricken and guilt-ridden. He therefore opposed the development of the more powerful hydrogen bomb. He was accused of subversive activities and stripped of his security clearance. But this victim of the McCarthy era maintained for the rest of his life that if mankind is to survive, nuclear weapons must be internationally controlled. Dr. Edward Teller has been called the father of the hydrogen bomb. He voiced many objections against peace treaties and restrictions on nuclear development. But in his book entitled The Legacy of Hiroshima, he wrote, "We must work for the establishment of a world authority sustained by moral force and physical force, a worldwide government capable of enforcing worldwide law and worldwide disarmament." In his first State of the Union address in 1946, President Truman called for development of the UN until we all recognize the world as one society. He also organized a United Nations police force to contain North Korean aggression against South Korea. In addition, he appointed former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Mrs. Roosevelt chaired the committee that developed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 2 years after the Korean War truce, on January 26, 1955, General Douglas MacArthur, the man who wanted to widen the war in Korea, spoke to the American Legion in Los Angeles, California. His address was entitled, "Can War Now Be Outlawed in the World?" In this speech, he vigorously and eloquently called for the nations of the world to seek the total abolition of war. In his State of the Union address in 1959, President Dwight D. Eisenhower called for a genuine rule of law for all nations. In his address to the United Nations on September 22, 1960, he called for a world community rooted in law and justice. And in his State of the Union address in 1960, Ike called for the empowerment of the International Court of Justice and the development of world law. President George Herbert Walker Bush openly touted a new world order and set forth to make the United Nations work. In the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, Bush organized a 34-nation coalition to resist Iraqi aggression. Capitalists and communists, Arabs and Jews, and other unlikely combinations cooperated to contain Saddam Hussein. Operating under the authority of the unanimous Security Council resolutions, President Bush made the United Nations work. The U.S. was held in high favor as the nation that led the world to resist aggression and contain Saddam Hussein. The pursuit of a world security system is not a Republican or Democratic idea. In fact, it was Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee for president in 1940, who visited our Soviet allies during World War II and returned to the U.S. to write a national bestseller entitled One World. Patriots from both major political parties have made heroic contributions to the quest for peace, but President John F. Kennedy has definitely played the larger part. From his salad days as a senator to the last week of his life, JFK was a persistent advocate for a world security system and the development of world law. It is all carefully chronicled in the new book, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's Grand and Global Alliance, World Order for the New Century, Centenary Edition.
My name is Joseph A. Bagnall. Today is January 15th, 2016, my 86th birthday. I am an adjunct in history at Palomar College in San Marcos, California. I have a variable 40 to 60% assignment each semester. I've chosen my 86th birthday to record my last lecture, a lecture in which I will summarize my educational career and reveal my most important research. Research that documents President John F. Kennedy's strong commitment to the development of world law. I have a love affair with United States history. I have taught this subject for the past 17 years at the Palomar College Satellite at Camp Pendleton. My students are Marines and naval personnel. They are men and women who serve their country and spend their spare time in the evening earning credits for their college degrees.
Dr. Bagnall's research is presented in his latest book, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's Grand and Global Alliance, World Order for the New Century, Centenary Edition.
I now shall review and analyze this centenary edition for you. Uncovering the Kennedy Legacy. Let's begin the process of uncovering by noting that John F. Kennedy's memory has been poorly served. The media have defined him as the central figure in a murder mystery, or as the princely figure of Camelot, or in terms of his private life. And as a result, we are approaching the 100th anniversary of his birth with no clear definition of his presidential legacy. The 100th anniversary of his birth is coming up in 2017. It is preeminently the time to move beyond the sensational facets of his life and death. We must promote the 100th anniversary of his birth, May 29th, 2017, not the November 22nd anniversary of his death. Let's examine his commitments and achievements, not the sensational facets of his life. The Peace Corps is an important part of JFK's legacy. It was created by executive order March 1st, 1961. It was then authorized by Congress September 21st, 1961. From 1961 to 2013, over 210,000 Americans have served needy people in 139 countries as Peace Corps volunteers. Next, let's look carefully at the Apollo space program. In 1960, Kennedy campaigned for the presidency. He warned of a dangerous missile gap and called attention to the fact that the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, mankind's first unmanned satellite. Our national humiliation was compounded soon thereafter when Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, became the first human to orbit the Earth. The United States had been beaten twice in the space race, and JFK was determined to respond in a manner that would establish U.S. supremacy in space. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy bravely called a joint session of Congress and announced to his countrymen and the world that we would send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth before the close of the 1960s. He then obtained the funds to strengthen NASA and create the Apollo space program. By the time of his assassination, JFK's goal for a moon landing within the decade of the 1960s was well on course. By May 16, 1963, Major Gordon L. Cooper had completed a 22-orbit flight around the Earth. This next series of photographs are courtesy of NASA. On November 16, 1963, Wernher von Braun, NASA director, and President Kennedy raised their hands in a symbolic gesture of upward and onward for the space race. This next picture features the astronauts who were chosen to carry out our mission to the moon. Left to right, the late Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. And Michael Collins, the pilot of the lunar module. And here is the lunar module that carried the astronauts to the moon. This capsule was a small part of a Saturn V rocket that left the Earth on July 16, 1969. This huge rocket was carrying out the Apollo 11 moon mission, and 4 days later, July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first two men to walk on the moon. They spent the next 21 hours on the moon while Michael Collins kept the command module in orbit. Armstrong and Aldrin then rejoined Michael Collins in the command module, and they all splashed down in the Pacific Ocean near the Hawaiian Islands on July 24, 1969. Kennedy's Apollo program had succeeded. Men had walked on the moon before the close of the 1960s, but that was not all. This successful mission was the first of 6 U.S. moon landings. In all, 12 American astronauts have walked on the moon. 24 of them have orbited the moon, some in preparation for the Apollo 11 mission. President Kennedy's moon mission opened the era of space travel. This is monumental in the history of our country and the history of mankind. But as large as this achievement was, the central thrust of the brief Kennedy presidency was his dogged quest for peace in the nuclear age. Kennedy continually spoke of peace and a way to secure it. As a United States Senator, Kennedy's most important speeches were compiled under the title of The Strategy of Peace. He made his priorities plain when this book became a campaign document. It was sold in paperback everywhere. Now, let's put the campaign of 1960 in context. Senator Kennedy not only had to deal with the residue of terror from the McCarthy era, but he was also hampered by the very vocal right-wing John Birch Society. He bravely faced these extremists with an eloquent speech on disarmament delivered in Washington, D.C., December 11th, 1959. He courageously declared, "We must combine disarmament with the strengthening of the United Nations." On June 11th, 1960, he outlined what he would do as president in a 12-point agenda in foreign policy. His 11th point was, "We must move toward the eventual rule of world law." The next bold stroke by Democratic nominee JFK and his supporters was to insert the following plank into the Democratic platform of 1960. These are brave words. "Through the machinery of the United Nations, we shall work for disarmament, the establishment of an international police force, the strengthening of the World Court, and the establishment of world law." In the election of 1960, John Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon, chose his cabinet, and prepared for the inauguration. The centerpiece of JFK's inaugural speech was his call for a grand and global alliance, North, South, East, and West, against tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. The New York Times recognized this and covered the event with a banner headline that read, "Kennedy sworn in, asks global alliance against tyranny, want, disease, and war." This was an accurate summary of an address that was 27 paragraphs in length. Virtually all of it dealt with foreign policy matters and international concerns. In paragraph 9, the president pledged to enlarge the area where the UN's writ may run. In paragraph 15, Kennedy challenged the Soviets, saying, "Let both sides formulate precise proposals for the inspection and control of arms, and bring the absolute power to destroy other nations under the absolute control of all nations." And in paragraph 18, JFK said, "Let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just, and the weak secure, and the peace preserved." The inaugural address boldly emphasized global problems, with two clear references to the need to strengthen the UN, and one clear reference for the need to develop world law. But 3 paragraphs from his closing, Kennedy finally departed from his international themes, and with great emphasis shouted out, "And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." This is the only line modern media publicizes. It is also the only part of the address most Americans can recognize. President Kennedy spoke before the UN General Assembly, September 25, 1961. He admonished the delegates that mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. And he continued, "To destroy arms, however, is not enough. We must create even as we destroy, creating worldwide law and law enforcement, even as we outlaw worldwide war and weapons. And as we extend the rule of law on earth," he said, "so must we extend it to man's new domain, outer space." In the same address, Kennedy gave his most succinct rationale for his agenda when he shouted, "For we far prefer world law in the age of self-determination to world war in the age of mass extermination." He closed his address with a warning: "Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames. Save it we can, and save it we must," he said, "and then shall we earn the eternal thanks of mankind, and as peacemakers, the eternal blessing of God." 5 days after this address, JFK signed H.R. 9118, thereby creating the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In his remarks upon signing the bill, he said, "Our ultimate goal, as the Act points out, is a world free from war and free from the dangers and burdens of armaments, in which the use of force is subordinated to the rule of law, and in which international adjustments to a changing world are achieved peacefully." Time constraints prohibit tracing the details of the Cuban Missile Crisis, But as everyone knows, the United States and the Soviet Union came perilously close to nuclear war. The American people were chastened by the Cuban Missile experience, and President Kennedy had a much more attentive audience when he made speeches about peace. In his third State of the Union address, Kennedy assured the American people that our defense budget was more than our allies combined, but he said, "Our commitment to national safety is not a commitment to expand our military establishment indefinitely. We do not dismiss disarmament as an idle dream. In this quest, the United Nations requires our full and continued support. Today, the United Nations is primarily the protector of the small and the weak, and a safety valve for the strong. Tomorrow, it can form the framework for a world of law, a world in which no nation dictates the destiny of another." On June 10, 1963, President Kennedy gave an epic commencement address at American University. Once again, he said that the world should be made safe for diversity, and the UN should be developed into a genuine world security system capable of enforcing world law. On July 26, 1963, in a television address, President Kennedy said that a treaty had been successfully negotiated to bring nuclear testing under international control. He then described the horror of nuclear war, explaining that 300 million people could be destroyed in the first 60 minutes. While JFK emphasized nuclear horror and the arms race as reasons for adoption of a nuclear test ban, he knew that was only part of the rationale. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was conceived not only as a curb on the arms race, but more importantly, as a means of ending deadly radioactive fallout in the atmosphere. Norman Cousins and Dr. Linus Pauling had spent many years campaigning for a treaty in order to deal with the accumulation of new, toxic, man-made radioactive elements that were falling out all over the world. As a presidential envoy, Mr. Cousins had also met with Pope John XXIII and Premier Khrushchev in order to lay important groundwork for JFK's atmospheric ban. When the treaty was completed, the next step was to get Senate ratification. In his news conference of September 12, 1963, President Kennedy made a strong appeal for public support for Senate ratification of the treaty. He commended Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana and Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois for delivering speeches that made a very effective case for ratification. And he added, "The treaty will allow all of us who inhabit the earth, our children and children's children, to breathe easier, free from the fear of nuclear test fallout. It will curb the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries, and it will provide a small foundation upon which a world of law can be built." In an address at the UN on September 20th, 1963, JFK listed some things that could be done to improve the UN. One proposal he made was a worldwide program of conservation, which he said could protect the forests and wild game preserves, now in danger of extinction for all time, improve the harvest of food from the ocean, and prevent the contamination of air and water by industrial as well as nuclear pollution. He also reminded us the earth, the sea, the air are the concern of every nation, and science, technology, and education can be the ally of every nation. When Kennedy spoke these words, the Santa Barbara oil spill and the beginning of environmental consciousness were more than 5 years away. Ozone depletion was not widely understood. The greenhouse effect and global warming were not discussed, and the destruction of the rainforests and the problem of acid rain were not concerns. Furthermore, Earth Day had not yet been established. In this context, JFK's preoccupation with environmental issues and his proposal for a worldwide program of conservation seem prophetic. The Kennedy administration resolved the most pressing problem of atmospheric pollution of that day with the nuclear test ban of 1963. Man-made radioactive elements have been virtually eliminated in the atmosphere as a result. Given the approach that Kennedy took on environmental issues, it seems certain if he were with us today, he would be leading a vigorous effort to attack the problems of global warming, destruction of rainforests, acid rain, ozone depletion, and other environmental threats. There is no doubt he would still say, some 50 years later, that we must proceed with a worldwide program of conservation. Back to his speech of September 20th, 1963, he also said, "The science of weapons and war has made us all, far more than 18 years ago in San Francisco, one world, one human race, with one common destiny. In such a world, absolute sovereignty no longer assures us of absolute security. The conventions of peace must pull abreast and then ahead of the inventions of war. The United Nations, building on its successes and learning from its failures, must be developed into a genuine world security system." On October 19th, 1963, President Kennedy gave the commencement address in the stadium at the University of Maine. He told the graduates that our enormous arms buildup was designed to convince the Soviets they could not win and that it would fall to their advantage to join us in the building of a genuine and enforceable peace. Kennedy's legendary 1,000 days would soon play out with his fateful trip to Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. 2 days before that dastardly trip, JFK submitted the 17th annual report to the Congress of the United States on United States participation in the United Nations. He closed the document with these words, "But despite non-cooperation from some members and wavering support from others, the organization moves significantly toward the goal of a peace system, worldwide in scope. The United States will continue to lend vigorous support to the building of that system." On November 22nd, 1963, vigorous support to the building of that system vanished with the assassination of the president. A quick summary of the salient points of my book. As we wade ankle deep in the shallow tides of the information age, the survival agenda of the greatest generation has been lost. This is a momentous loss which has implications regarding the future of the human race. Think about it. The survival agenda of the greatest generation is not even discussed in the 21st century. My book contains a section called The 7 Deadly Trends. There are 7 deadly trends in rapid development in the 21st century. The first is nuclear proliferation, which is as current as today's headlines. While some nations are trying to tell others who can be in the nuclear club, the nuclear club is expanding, and the threat of thermonuclear war is growing. If a mid-sized hydrogen bomb is ever exploded over a modern city, in the first 1,000th of a second, a fireball would form with a temperature of 20 million degrees Fahrenheit. That is hotter than the surface of the sun. The fireball would vaporize everything in the area and create firestorms that would spread outward at a rate of 600 miles per hour. At 10 miles outward, the firestorms would slow down to 200 miles per hour, but they would extend outward to a 50-mile radius. The bomb would also blast a crater 5 miles in circumference and 440 feet deep. The atomic trigger would scatter toxic radioactive elements far and wide. All of this horror could be released by one 20 megaton bomb, deliverable by only one missile. At the height of the Cold War, in 1953, the Soviets tested a hydrogen bomb in excess of 50 megatons. Imagine, if you can, what a full-scale nuclear war would mean, with an exchange of hundreds of nuclear weapons. As we tinker with this problem, the survival agenda of the greatest generation and the Kennedy proposals for international control of nuclear weapons are ignored. The second deadly trend of our time is international terrorism, which has become a constant threat to all nations. When we gain the wisdom to organize all nations against terrorism, the problem will be, if not resolved, at the very least, minimized. When I say all nations, I mean Islamic nations as well. If we keep making threats and accusations against all Muslims, they will more readily support and unite with the terrorists. The third deadly trend is global warming, which threatens to alter the shorelines and the weather patterns of the world. It has already created some harsh climate changes in various parts of the earth. The fourth deadly trend is the destruction of rainforests. As we slash and burn the lungs of the world, we diminish the possibility of future medical discoveries. We are causing the extinction of 150 species per day, and we are contributing to the nasty alteration of weather patterns worldwide. The fifth deadly trend is ozone depletion. According to NASA, the ozone hole has grown to a size larger than the North American continent. This means a huge landmass will have constant bombardment with deadly ultraviolet rays. The sixth deadly trend is acid rain, which is destroying forests and lakes in Canada, northeastern United States, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Calcium carbonate is being dumped in many lakes of the world in order to help restore them as havens for the sustenance of life. The seventh deadly trend is apathy. In our finest presidential election year, 60% of us turn out to cast a ballot. It might be better if we challenged our electorate with an appeal to intellect and reason. Much of our campaign rhetoric involves petty sniping and childish exchanges. Inspirational leaders and heroic thoughts are quite rare. Could President Kennedy's Grand and Global Alliance and his proposed world program of conservation resolve the 7 deadly trends? Should we revive the survival agenda of the greatest generation? Should we apply John Kennedy's strategy of peace? Do we need international control of nuclear weapons? Do we need Kennedy's worldwide program of conservation? Do we need enforceable law in our cities, our states, our nation? Then why not enforceable law in the world? Is it acceptable for business corporations to become global? Then why not labor? And why not government? The greatest generation left us the United Nations on U.S. soil. It has 3 branches of government that resemble, at least in function, the 3 branches of the U.S. government. It has a universal Declaration of Human Rights that contains the freedoms found in the U.S. Bill of Rights and more. John Kennedy repeatedly said we must strengthen the UN. Is it possible that we might use American federalism as a model for world federalism? Could world federalism save the forests of the world, just as American federalism preserved millions of acres of national parks and national forest reserve? Could world federalism based on American federalism control nuclear weapons? Could world federalism create enforceable world laws based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just as American federalism has created laws based on the United States Bill of Rights? Could world federalism harbor pluralism and diversity, as American federalism has done? Could world federalism extend the vote worldwide, just as U.S. federalism extended the vote to former slaves, women, and all citizens 18 years of age? And now for the most important question. Wouldn't world federalism, based on an American model, be the ultimate American triumph? I have covered a portion of the material in my centenary edition of President Kennedy's Grand and Global Alliance. There is much more that you may be interested to explore. My book is available online in paperback at a nominal cost. An ebook version is also available online for less than $1. It has been a pleasure to share my last lecture with you.
Together we shall save our
Together we shall save our planet.
Or together we shall perish.
Together
in its
we
flames.
shall perish in its flames.
A grand and global alliance
To a genuine world security system. A worldwide program of conservation could protect the forest and prevent the contamination of air and water by industrial as well as nuclear pollution.